Hello everyone, JediMario88 here, and welcome back to another tile guide. Today we're going to be covering the shack, and there's a lot to get into, so let's not have too long of an introduction and just jump right into it. We'll start out with a quick overview of the tile. The general layout of the shack is very simple and easy to learn since it spawns on nearly every outdoor map. One wall will spawn with a window in the middle, one wall with a door, and one wall with a pallet in the opening. The window and pallet are both incredibly strong. However, since the pallet is a single use, survivors should opt to play around the window for as long as possible. The pallet is a god pallet, that is, it's essentially impossible to play around as a killer once it's dropped. Hence, it's very valuable and you should avoid dropping it unless not doing so will cause you to go down. Two lockers spawn on the wall with the plain door. Sometimes a gen will spawn in the middle of the room and a totem will spawn next to the pallet. A hook can spawn in either of the back corners on the shack, and a staircase to the basement can also spawn inside. Now, let's take a look at some ways to begin your chase at shack. Let's start with what to do if the killer approaches while you're inside on the generator. Having only 3 entrances to the building makes this short and simple to understand. If the killer comes through the door, you have an easy opportunity to vault the window or run to the pallet. If the killer vaults the window, you can either run out the door or through the pallet. If the killer comes through the pallet, you can either run out the door or vault the window. Now let's take a look at how to enter the shack while you're already being chased. If you're approaching the window side, simply take the window. If you're approaching the pallet side, run through the pallet. If you're approaching the door side, go through the door and head for the window from the inside. If you're approaching from the backside, run for either the door or pallet, whichever is closer. Naturally, not all approaches will perfectly match these situations, so it'll be up to you to determine the best course of action. Now let's take a look at the basic ways to loot the shack. Since shack is such a common tile throughout every map, it tends to be one that players, both killers and survivors, have a lot of practice with. Therefore, there are a ton of different techniques that both sides have learned to implement in order to get a leg up on each other. I will cover as many as I can, though there are many, so I will probably miss some. We'll start off with the ideal path for survivors to run. The best outcome for survivors is to simply run through the door and vault the window to the outside. If the killer follows you directly, they won't be able to catch up since they'll spend so much time vaulting the window, and you'll easily be able to vault this window 3 times before it blocks. And then you can go somewhere else to avoid wasting the pallet. To avoid this happening, many killers will try to mind game the window in order to score a hit. Instead of following directly, they'll show the red light through the door, then run around the outside back to the window in hopes they made the survivor vault it. If the survivor vaults, the killer can usually score a hit or force the survivor to run a less optimal path. To avoid this as a survivor, you should wait a few feet away from the window and watch the door closely to see whether the killer follows you through or tries this mind game. If he tries the mind game, you have 2 good options. The first is to wait for him to come back through the door, and then vault the window, though this runs the risk of the killer approaching from another angle that you aren't watching. The second is to run through the pallet, which is generally the better option, since whether you go around the backside or the window side, you can usually get back to the door. However, it's usually better to run around the backside of shack since the killer cannot cut you off by vaulting the window. If the killer does catch you off guard with this mind game, don't worry. You can still run around to the pallet, or you can immediately vault back over the window if you think you have time to. If survivors are wary of the first mind game demonstrated, some killers will add a layer to it. They may pretend to be executing the first mind game, but then simply follow them through the shack anyway. If the survivor runs for the pallet early, they may not have enough distance to make it all the way back to the door on the other side, forcing them to either drop the pallet or take a hit. The counterplay here is quite simple. Be patient. Wait an extra second or 2 to confirm whether the killer is doubling back or following you through. Once you know, act accordingly. One mind game the streamer Otsdarva sometimes uses is to vault the window, then moonwalk all the way to the pallet. Survivors will sometimes get so caught up looking behind them that they simply don't notice what he's actually doing. Again, this is another pretty simple counter for survivors. Confirm that the killer is following you around the loop before you move to the next area. Wait at corners until you see the red stain start to come around, and then move to the next position. This can help to prevent you from getting cut off by a sneaky killer. The last common counterplay to the common method of running shack window is actually quite simple. After you vault the window, follow them for a second, then go back and vault the window again. This forces the survivor to run the loop the opposite way and approach the window and pallet from more dangerous angles. I will cover some ways to run those angles next. If the killer vaults the window while you're running it the normal way, you have 3 main options to choose from. 1. Run somewhere else. This is often a valid option if you feel your current location is unsafe and you think you can make it to a better area. 2. Run around the back of the shack and make it to the pallet side. This is impractical at best since the distance is long to safety and chances are you'll either get hit or drop the shack pallet once you get there. It is an option, however, if you feel so inclined. 3. Run back the way you came and try to vault the window from the outside. This is typically your best choice. If you recognize the killer's move early enough, you'll have time to either medium vault or fast vault. Sometimes the killer will double back into the shack to try and hit you, and it can be hard to tell since you won't have much time to wait and see what he does. This raises your second option, which is not to vault the window at all and instead run straight to the pallet. While this risks you having to drop the pallet or take a hit, it can also put you in a safer place and give you another opportunity to vault the window later on. If you do choose not to vault the window and end up running to the pallet, you may end up running the inside pallet side. This can also happen if you or the killer approaches the loop from the pallet side. This is another pretty bad spot to be in as a survivor, since again you have 2 choices. Your first choice is to vault the window. This has many benefits. If the killer follows you through, you're very likely to get away scot-free, and afterwards you can force the loop to be run the normal way. However, many killers anticipate this and will simply pretend to come inside, but will actually walk to the outside of the window to attack you. If this happens, you normally won't have time to get anywhere safe before they hit you. Your other option as survivor is to fake the window and run out through the door. This has the benefit of generally not being expected, but also puts you very far from any safety and forces you to run an unsafe way. It'll be up to you to figure out which option is safer. Finally, if you didn't take the shack window and instead ran through the pallet, you may find yourself playing shack from the outside pallet side angle. This follows the same basic principle of the last section, though this situation is slightly safer for survivors. You can vault the window or fake it. If you vault, the killer may double back and try to catch you in the shack. If you fake it, the killer may or may not swing or double back and give you extra distance. The benefit of faking in this case is that it gives you the opportunity to start running the tile normally again if you have enough distance. Now that I've covered all the standard ways to loop shack that I can think of, I'll give you a couple extra tips and tricks that you probably won't use as much. My first tip is to take a quick pause at corners if you don't know where the killer is. One of your greatest friends as a survivor is that your camera covers a very wide area. See for instance how I can out-mind game the killer by just pausing and waiting to make sure I know where he is before I move. On this diagram, I've marked out some good places to pause and wait for the killer if you don't know where he is. While it isn't usually practical to run to the back of shack in a chase, it's not actually always a bad place to be. If the killer is inside the shack, you can actually spot them through the boarded up windows as a survivor and respond accordingly to whichever way they go. It's very hard for them to mind game this, and the wall is quite long, so you'll have plenty of time to respond whichever way they go. If you're the killer in this situation, it's best to force them towards the pallet though, to try and get it out of the way sooner. If you're running around the back of shack towards the door and you get in ahead of the killer, you can stop running, turn right, and briefly hide in the corner. This is not a place you typically want to stay for very long because the killer might hear you if you're injured or see the lack of scratch marks and look around for you, but you may be able to run out the door behind them. This trick can actually work. Both pieces of footage you're watching were done in a live match or against an unwitting test subject. However, it has a very limited number of situations where it works, so it typically will not come into play. My last tip for Survivor is that there are a lot of things that spawn in the shack other than just the window and pallet that you may be able to use to your advantage. In a desperate situation, you can hide behind the generator, hop into a locker, or run into the basement to avoid a killer. Just remember that these are pretty high-risk things to do, and they should be safe for situations where you have no other options. As for killers, many killers have powers that greatly help in dealing with shack, but some do not, like Wraith and Bubba. If you find that you're struggling to run shack as a killer, you may consider running Clown's teachable perk Bamboozle, which blocks windows for a limited time after you vault them. This can force survivors to either leave the tile, to drop the pallet, or give you a hit. The former is the best choice for a survivor, the latter two are the best for a killer. Before we start talking about some more specific killer things for shack, I want to talk about how to win this tile as killer. Shack is a pretty hard tile for the killer to play, generally speaking. The killer can win by hitting a survivor, but forcing the pallet to be dropped is also something of a win for the killer. Since only one spawns per match, it should be promptly broken to make future chases easier. Remember that forcing the survivor to run the direction you want them to will make accomplishing either of these objectives much easier, whether you score a hit or get the pallet dropped. Coming up in the next section, I'll lay out any tricks I know of for certain types of killers or certain individual killers that can help you. Let's start off with rushing type killers. Admittedly, I'm not fantastic at playing this type of killer, and they all feel a little bit different, so take my opinion for what it's worth. The rushing killers that I'm referring to are characters like Hillbilly, Demogorgon, Oni, Blight, and Wesker, which have the ability to move very quickly. These killers can generally perform pretty well at the shack if they're experienced because they have the potential to move so fast that they can hit survivors before they can make it to safety. If they mind game effectively, they may also be able to hit survivors immediately after they vault the window the safe way. Your best play as a survivor against these types of killers is to fake windows if you think they'll rush you, and to avoid running this tile in the traditional way. Instead, do what you can not to give the killer the opportunity and the sightline to rush you at all. This can be very challenging, especially against killers like Blight who can turn corners very effectively. However, many of these killers need to prepare their attack before they even know where you are, and they're going on game sense alone. In these cases, moving unpredictably can help you to avoid a hit. Ranged killers also perform particularly well at the shack because the window and pallet are generally unsafe against them. Running through the inside of shack against these killers is a bad idea because it gives them an easy sightline and boxes you in. Window fakes are an okay option, but a patient killer will wait out these fakes to get an easy hit. Moreover, some ranged killers can reliably score hits at this tile even if the pallet is dropped. When combined with the mind games I presented earlier, this tile suddenly loses a lot of its safety for survivors. Good killers can find incredibly creative angles to score hits at shack, and I can't cover every possibility. However, there is one weakness most of them have in common that can be exploited effectively. They're very slow. As such, running around the outside of the shack and only going inside when necessary tends to be pretty effective for survivors. It's best to avoid going inside the shack against this type of killer when it can be helped. The Doctor actually has a unique way to play around shack. On top of his normal power to simply prevent survivors from vaulting the window or dropping the pallet, he can also play around the God pallet under the right circumstances. If he and the survivor are both approaching from the outside, and a shock is just a little bit late to prevent the pallet drop, he can vault in the window and still catch the survivor before they can vault back over the pallet to escape. Deathslinger also deserves some mention for something that only he can pull off and no other killer. If you're approaching from the back of the shack, Deathslinger can actually shoot between the slots of the boarded up windows and hit survivors that way. Be wary of this when facing an experienced Deathslinger. Now we're going to move on to the setup killers. These aren't the only ways that you can set up as these killers, but there's some ideas to start out with and work with. Let's start off with the trap type killers like Trapper and Hag. One of the most natural places to put traps as these killers is directly in front of the window. This isn't a bad place by any means and can effectively shut down the shack as a loop, but it's predictable and survivors may disarm your traps or avoid the area altogether. Trapping the pallet makes sense for the same reasons, but is also predictable. Trapping the outside corners of the shack on the window side is a much better idea since it's less predictable, though experienced survivors will still likely check, and it still interrupts the loop. However, it is possible to avoid here. If you hook a survivor in the basement, trapping all the entrances to shack can make getting a rescue nearly impossible. Next we move on to Clown. I really don't play Clown that much, so I didn't have any idea what might actually work at shack. To figure it out, I pulled one of my friends into a custom game to test it out and see what would work. Here's what we found. My first instinct was to try dropping a bottle right at the door and running shack the survivor-sided way. However, the bottles did not slow my friend down enough for me to hit him. When I combine it with a simple double back, however, he had no safe options, as you can see in this clip. His best option at this point was simply to leave shack altogether. Next, I tried dropping a bottle directly on the window and forcing him towards the pallet. This worked pretty well, as it more or less forced my friend to drop the pallet or take a hit. Even when he played creatively, the cloud lingered long enough to prevent him from safely playing around the window. I'm sure it's possible to play around this, but it definitely makes things more difficult for the survivor. Also, dropping a bottle at the window and then running it the orthodox way did prevent the survivor from making it back to the window. Overall, dropping a bottle somewhere near the window and then looping with some basic mind games seemed to be the best way to get a hit here as Clown. The gas cloud has a pretty wide area and lingers for a decent amount of time, so it really messes with the survivor's ability to loop and forces them to use abnormal pathing. I'll quickly break down this chase as an example of how effective it can be. Here I throw a bottle to the right side of the window. My friend decides to run towards the pallet to avoid looping through the gas cloud. When he gets back out to the window, he has to immediately vault it to avoid the gas cloud, but is slowed by it anyway. My friend is slowed a second time by the lingering gas cloud, ensuring that he cannot make it back to the window. After this third vault, the window blocks, giving me an easy down. This entire chase took under 30 seconds, and I only had to use one bottle. Artist is also very strong at Shack. If you set up your crows to cover the entrances to Shack, you can force survivors to play less optimally. If the survivor tries to run Shack the traditional way, put a bird to cover the outside of the window and then follow them through normally. They'll either vault the window and get hit by your bird, or run to pallet and drop it for you. You can also place a bird to cover the door, then double back and vault the window. This will also result in a hit or them dropping the pallet. If you're playing from the pallet side, simply trap the window and follow them into Shack. They'll have to run out through the other door and you can score a hit easily. As a survivor, your best bet against the artist is to run around the back side of the Shack because she's less likely to set up crows for you there. If you can, you should just leave Shack altogether. Dredge has a lot of possibilities because of the conveniently placed lockers inside the Shack. You can teleport to these lockers to try and get survivors off guard or score an easy hit. However, most survivors will be very wary of this and will either lock these lockers or be prepared to run away from them at a moment's notice. You can also leave a remnant near the outside of the window and follow them through the Shack, then teleport back if they vault. However, good survivors will make use of your slow speed and run to the pallet if they hear you place a remnant down, so be ready to quickly cancel your power and continue the chase in such a case. If you're running pallet side, leave a remnant near the pallet and follow the survivor through. If they vault, teleport back and try to cut them off. If they run for the door, cancel your power and follow them. Next, I want to talk about team involvement at Shack, because this is one of the best places to help out your fellow survivors. If you have the perk head on, the locker near the door is a fantastic spot to make a play, since the survivor in chase can force the killer to come by it, and it's very hard to dodge. Body blocking is also incredibly effective at the Shack, because the entrances are narrow and the killer really has no option to go around. This makes it very easy to insert yourself into the chase at an opportune moment, particularly at the door or pallet sides. This is especially helpful if the killer wants to carry your teammate to the basement. Standing in the doorway is an incredibly effective way to block the killer from getting there. Finally, it's worth noting that using Shack pallet to save a teammate is a worthy cause. If an injured teammate goes down under this pallet, it can be good to hide nearby and try to get a pallet save. Standing between the window and pallet on the outside is your best option, because you're close enough to get the save, but in a convenient spot to escape if the killer comes looking for you. This pallet can be useful for pallet saves even if the survivor isn't picked up underneath. If the killer picks up the survivor in the Shack, and the nearest hook requires him to go out through the pallet side to get to it, dropping the pallet to get the save or just to stall time may help a survivor wiggle from the killer's grasp. The same is true the other way. If the killer is trying to get a survivor to the basement from the outside of the Shack, waiting near the pallet and either saving them with it or just throwing it down can prevent a basement hook from occurring, which could save an entire game. Finally, I want to look at some variations of the Shack depending on what map you're playing on. Most variations of Shack are so similar, they're not really worth distinguishing between. However, there are two variations that have very significant differences. The first is Dead Dog Saloon. This version of the Shack is much weaker for survivors than normal due to a breakable wall placed between the two lockers. Once broken, it becomes nearly impossible to play around the window with any efficiency, and the pallet becomes the safest part of the Shack. There are also large gaps in the walls of the Shack, which ranged killers like Huntress and Deathslinger can easily shoot through, meaning this isn't a place you should stick around for too long as a survivor. The next big variation comes from Forsaken Boneyard. This version of Shack is basically normal, however there are some cracks in the walls that can be used to look through, and a window in the back which is significantly easier to see through compared to the normal boarded up ones. This makes situational awareness overall easier. It's also worth noting that on Crotuspren, Ormond, and Autohaven, there's a piece of sheet metal right next to the window of shack that you can get stuck on the outside. I don't know why this is here, but the devs still haven't removed it. There are a few more variations of shack that have minor differences related to obstacles or situational awareness. Macmillan only has one boarded up window on the backside of shack to look through, but it has an extra one right between the window and pallet. Red Forest and the Swamp share a version of shack that is sloppily built and has plenty of cracks in the walls to look through. Yamaoka Estates Shack has some paper windows with little tears in them. These are very challenging to look through compared to other versions. Finally, Garden of Joy has some pretty easy windows to see through, but also a lot of garbage lying around that can slow you down as a survivor if you aren't paying attention. Well, that concludes my tile guide for Shack. I really hope this video is helpful because it took such a long time to make. I'm going to be honest, I've really burnt out on Dead by Daylight, so this is probably going to be the last tile guide for quite a while unless it really blows up. If you want more content like this, smash that like button and share the video around so I have a reason to make more. Also, I want to give a big shout out to all the different friends who helped me record footage for this video. You guys know who you are, and I never could have made this video without you all. With that said, I'll see everyone in the next video. Bye-bye.